And today we are continuing our conversation about post-Soviet Europe and Eurasia, this time with a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, Dr. Sam Charap. And please correct me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. At RAND, his primary research interests concern political economy and foreign policy of Russia and the former Soviet states, European and Eurasian regional security, and US-Russia deterrence, strategic stability, and arms control. From November 2012 until April 2017, Dr. Charap was the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Prior to joining the Institute, he served at the US Department of State as the Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and on the Secretary's policy planning staff covering Russia and Eurasia. Earlier, Dr. Charap was Director for Russia and Eurasia at the Center for American Progress. He was also a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Moscow Center and the International Center for Policy Studies in Kiev. And he was a Fulbright Scholar at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. His articles have appeared in the Washington Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, Survival, Current History, and several other journals. And in 2017, his book, Everyone Loses, The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia, which he co-authored with Timothy Carlton, was published. It might be especially useful to those of us who are interested in the deep analysis of the 2014 Ukraine crisis, as well as the failed policies that led to it in the first place and how best to move forward. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Sam Charap. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for that introduction, and apologies again for the technical difficulties. Hopefully those are past. Yana mentioned in her introduction, or ended her introduction with describing the book that I co-wrote with Tim Colton that was published in 2017 about our argument about the sort of origins and consequences of the Ukraine crisis that began in 2014. And we ended the book with sort of a trying in like a few pages to suggest what an alternative set of policies might be to ameliorate the kind of terrible situation that we describe, where no party is better off than when they began. And it was large, it's probably like 3% of the book. And the book was meant mostly to be analytical and not prescriptive, but often I got the question, okay, well, so what do we do about it? And the problem that we described in the book was broader than just the events in and around Ukraine in 2014. It really had to do with seeing the Ukraine crisis as part of a broader contest for influence between Russia and the West in the in-between states, as we call them, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And we use that term in between here to mean countries caught in between, that is not party necessarily to the Russia-West dispute, but directly affected by it. And so that contest for influence seemed to us to have basically, the Ukraine crisis was a manifestation of it, rather than the most extreme manifestation of it, rather than something dramatically different. And so the question is, how do you address this dispute that has really reached such depths over core issues regarding the regional order? And so finished the book, published it, did some touring around with it, and then this question kept getting asked, and I thought to myself, well, I'd like to know the answer to that too. But the problem is, sitting in Arlington, Virginia, or even traveling to the region and talking to people, I can invent some idea about how to solve a problem, but it's nowhere near as good as when you have people from the region around the same table talking about these issues and trying to reach some degree of consensus among them. And so what we did in this project was try to answer that question about, что делать, what to do about the situation and the dispute over the regional order, by getting people broadly representative of the countries affected, both Russia, the EU, the US, and the countries in between, around the table, and asking them to think about, in this case, not where do we go immediately from here, but if there were a negotiation process that were to start in the future in a different political context, where could that negotiation possibly lead? And so, they had to do a little suspension of disbelief and think about a potential future where the parties are actually interested in resolving the problems. What could be the potential outcome? And so that is where this report originated. And if you were sent the PDF, you'll see that there are, I think, 21 names on the cover. And it was quite a challenging process because, we were divided into 4 groups covering different issues, and we all had to come to consensus among ourselves within those groups. So in my group, I was the chair of the regional conflicts group. I had a Russian, a Ukrainian, a Moldovan, a Georgian, and a German. And we all had to be able to sign up to the same piece of paper at the end. And that was, stretched my diplomatic skills, but ultimately that's what happens in multilateral negotiations if they're successful. That is, all the governments around the table have to sign the same piece of paper. And so we wanted to replicate that, because the advantage that track 2 efforts have like this is that we are not subject to the immediate political pressures that the first track is. We can think outside the box. We can ask ourselves, well, what would be desirable if the political circumstances were right? And so that's where that's the sort of origin story. I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to share, which does a more engaging job of telling the story than I can by myself. Hopefully we can see that. Yes, good.
Yes, that looks great.
So, as I mentioned, regional contest for influence, that has been at the core of the Russia-West dispute and also has done significant damage to the states caught in between. Fundamentally, this is about the regional order and defined as a set of rules, norms, and institutions that sort of govern different aspects of the region. In describing the current state, basically, we're at a moment where particularly the major powers are pursuing agendas in the security, economic, and on regional conflicts that are diametrically opposed to each other. And that's sort of where we are today. So we started from the premise that we need an alternative approach. Again, we were thinking about this project as looking for a future window of opportunity rather than like what the government should do now. So we're not naive enough to think that this piece of this report can be picked up and sort of implemented today given the current political circumstances. But the question is, when those circumstances arrive, what should people even be talking about, and what would be a potential outcome? What could we imagine as an alternative that might be acceptable to all the parties? And that's the advantage of having all these people around the same table and sort of asking them to sign up to the same document. So we worked in parallel. There were 4 groups, a group covering security architecture, one covering economic integration, one covering regional conflicts, and then we had a sort of steering committee. Asking ourselves the same question about where negotiations might lead if they were to begin. The premise that we worked on, and this is important here to keep in mind. So in our little conflicts subgroup, we did not know what the security architecture people were negotiating, so to speak, but our assumption was that progress was being made and/or agreements being found that were mutually acceptable to all parties. And why do I emphasize this? Because the 3 pieces of this dispute, our assumption, are interconnected, that they cannot be resolved, even though they must be addressed on parallel tracks. They can't be resolved without progress or resolution on another one of those tracks. So we're assuming a parallel process addressing the three separate issues, but all of which are moving at a sort of somewhat similar pace. So in our little working group, we did not know what the outcome of the security architecture discussion would be, but we knew that it would be something that was mutually acceptable to all the parties. So by definition, that means that we're not dealing with, to be concrete, like the dispute over NATO enlargement anymore into the former Soviet region, that somehow the parties had resolved that. So thinking about what conflict measures might be possible in that context was where we began in our conflict group. So as I mentioned, the three pieces, as far as the security architecture goes, the status quo is one where we have really no functioning dialogue mechanisms, no norms that are actually being followed by the major powers when it comes to their behavior towards the region and the in-between states. The choices of the in-between states themselves are contested by major powers. And none of them have, at least none of the non-aligned states, 4 out of the 6, of course, Armenia and Belarus are treaty allies of Russia, have credible security assurances at the moment. We see a lot of increased major power military activity in and around these countries that is affecting their security situation. So not a particularly pretty picture. So what was the proposal on security architecture? There are 4 parts here: regional security consultations, norms governing states' behavior, an offer of a alternative status arrangement for those countries that are interested in it, and related multilateral security guarantees and confidence and security building mechanisms. So what are the regional security consultations? The idea here is to have regular major power consultation and effective crisis communication regarding regional security issues. At the moment, there really just isn't any such dialogue at all. At best, it is sporadic. It certainly is not regularized, and the major powers do not have the habit of talking to each other about regional security issues. So the idea here is to be able to sort of hopefully preempt disputes, to have a mechanism for consultation during crisis. This would not be a new international body. The idea would to have a sort of standing multilateral consultation mechanism. So we use the example of the Global Coalition Against ISIS, which I believe even still meets, but it's just basically a group of countries that meet regularly to discuss a set of issues. The idea would that there would be permanent participants, that Russia, the US, and the EU, but that any state can participate in the meetings if its interests are affected or on the agenda. No decisions would be made without affected states' voices being heard. As far as norms go, the idea would be to define acceptable behavior for the major powers and the other states of the region. So the US, the EU, and Russia would commit to seek consensus before implementing any changes to the regional architecture, and not to seek future changes in composition of the regional security institutions without consulting first. So it's not granting any sort of veto, but just a commitment to consult and to try to find agreement. For those states that adopt the third way, and I'll get to what that is in a second, they make a commitment to consult with the regional security consultation mechanism, permanent participants, if they decide they want to change their security arrangements in the future. And then the third way status, which is the third piece of this part of the puzzle, which would be an offer to non-members of alliances that they could adopt if they so choose, that would provide security benefits and reduce competition among outside powers over their status, because basically the outside powers have signed on to this idea a priori in advance. So it's on the table. If a country in the region wants to adopt it, they can. So basically it's a bargain whereby major powers commit to respect the state's non-alignment in return for its agreement to consult with those permanent participants on future changes. The states that adopt this get a set of CSBMs and multilateral security guarantees from the major powers, and they undertake a responsibility to maintain a balance in their relations. What are the multilateral security guarantees? Of course, there is a checkered history of multilateral security guarantees in the region, and the report we directly address this, taking on why the Budapest Memorandum failed and why what we are proposing addresses those lessons learned. And I can get into what the Budapest Memorandum is if we'd like in the Q&A. So the point here is not to create a bulletproof, there's no such thing as a mechanism that can force a major power to do something against its will. You know, I think that when designing international agreements, we got to think about incentives that are created for states to change their behavior rather than binding mechanisms, which in international affairs, of course, don't really exist. So the point about multilateral security guarantees is that they establish standards of behavior and raise reputational cost, but that taken together with the other pieces of the proposal, namely, in this case, a state adopting a commitment to non-alignment, that it's much more likely that the major powers will uphold their end of the bargain under those circumstances. And so the set of CSBMs, and we have a pretty comprehensive listing in the report, are sort of a concrete manifestation of those security guarantees. It's a commitment to military restraint by major powers, and you know, specifically things like withdrawing forces, providing more transparency, and committing to cooperative security instruments. So, you know, giving essentially a more palpable sense of security to the in-between states that choose to adopt the third way status. So this is the first part of the proposal, the security architecture. It has benefits for all, we argue. Major powers get their geopolitical competition over the region contained. It's sort of put within an agreed framework. They have much fewer incentives to destabilize these states, and the states that choose to adopt the third way status benefit immediately, as opposed to the much more ephemeral way promises of future membership and alliances may or may not have a positive impact on their security. So as far as the second piece of the proposal, which is on economic integration, at the moment, states in the region face either or integration choices because the offer from the EU, which is the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, which is part of a broader association agreement, is incompatible with membership in the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia's regional integration, the Russia-led regional integration project. And so essentially, if you sign up to a DCFTA with the EU, you cannot be a member of any custom union, the Eurasian Economic Union included. And so those either or integration choices have created political problems and economic ones. They've disrupted trade, and there is no, at the moment, dialogue between even at the technical level, a regularized one, between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union. And there's also no dialogue, say, between non-members of either organization and, you know, those organizations themselves. So a country like, you know, Ukraine that is not a member of the EU, but a signatory of the DCFTA and has significant ongoing trade relations despite the war with Russia, has no mechanism of working at the same time with both of the both commissions to resolve any trade disputes. And as we've seen, there's a lot of using of trade policy or breaking of trade policy norms to pursue political objectives. So the proposal involves measures to facilitate multidirectional trade relations for the in-between states. So that's a mutually beneficial trade in both directions, that is with the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union. And those are different for the different countries because they are all in different, they're essentially their set of circumstances differs pretty dramatically at the moment. Trilateral consultation mechanisms like the ones I mentioned that don't exist, we would propose creating them, and norms of behavior that the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union would agree to governing their behavior towards the in-between states. So we, in this piece of the proposal, we started from where we are today. We did not focus on the sort of grand ideas of Lisbon to Vladivostok, that have often dominated discussions about economic resolving these dilemmas, which are frankly kind of fantastical under current circumstances. And instead, we built on current arrangements to reduce frictions and increase prosperity. So the multidirectional trading relations, there are two different sets: measures for improving the relations between the blocs, measures for the individual countries. So the idea, of course, being here that the moment the EU refuses to engage with the Eurasian Economic Union because of the disputes over security and regional conflicts, so we're assuming that those tracks are also moving forward, and that allows the EU to engage with the Eurasian Economic Union. And we have three specific ideas here. A task force between the two commissions, a trade-related framework agreement between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union, and a offer paralleling the security third way of an economic third way that would be open to countries that are non-members of the two blocs, but also not DCFTA signatories. So the only country that would apply to right now is Azerbaijan, but potentially in the future, other countries could adopt it as well. So as I mentioned, the measures for individual countries are pretty specific. The quote unquote easier cases, Georgia actually has trade relations with Russia and a DCFTA with the EU, but the trading arrangements with Russia are largely informal and very tenuous. So the proposal is to sort of formalize them and have them be more reliable. Armenia has its something called a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the EU, which is less than a DCFTA, but it is also a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, so it's in a way in a better position than the other four. It would benefit, though, from any future arrangements between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union because it is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Moldova and Ukraine are the harder cases. There would need to be additional negotiations to ensure compatibility of trade relations. And we discuss in the paper the model of the 2004 EU-Russia accession state trilateral talks that produced, this was before Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became members of the EU. There were talks with the European Commission, Russia, and those states to iron out concrete issues that would result from their membership in the EU for the consequences for trade with Russia, and mutually acceptable compromises were found. But those are really the hardest cases because at the moment, Russia has sort of conditioned normalization of trade with those countries to a certain extent on some walking back of the DCFTA. Belarus is even more complicated since we wrote this, of course, but it is not a WTO member, and that is a problem for dealing with the EU in any context. As I mentioned, Azerbaijan might be open to the third way proposal just because it's not a member of any economic grouping, and mostly such a proposal wouldn't affect its main exports of petroleum products, so it could be sort of an easy win, so to speak. Finally, there would be these sort of permanent trilateral mechanisms on economic relations of the in-between states with the two blocs. So in order to address short-term issues, trade disputes, consult on potential future changes, and perhaps most importantly, norms governing the behavior of the blocs. So, or this is the sort of more political pieces of this of the economic integration proposal. Both sides would agree to accept the other's legitimacy and not poach members from the other side or encourage exits or undermine its unity. So at the moment, there's a lot of all of that going on. That's very destabilizing. And so committing to treating the other Bloc, the other organization, as a sort of legitimate body that where you don't go around trying to undermine it, would be a major step forward. A commitment to consult, again to seek mutual consent, not necessarily to achieve it, but nonetheless to try. If there are going to be changes to integration arrangements in the region, and a commitment to respect the choices of the in-between states themselves, not to try to undermine them. So the idea, these measures would significantly reduce the likelihood of economic relations becoming a source of conflict, as they were in the Ukraine case. And I think that they would also facilitate, via increased trade, more prosperity in the in-between states, several of which are somewhat, have suffered economically through all this conflict. And I think the idea is that those economic incentives would grease the wheels on the other tracks, which are often more politically charged than economic integration. So on to perhaps the most politically charged, although I've been surprised in our talks about this report that the first one often seems to be the most charged. Of course, regional conflicts, and here, this was even written before the developments in Nagorno-Karabakh, but fundamentally, I'm not sure how much has changed in terms of what we're proposing. But for Georgia, for Armenia and Azerbaijan, for Moldova and Ukraine, particularly, conflict has had really comprehensive negative impacts on them, not just the direct, sort of death and destruction, but also the broader impact on their polities. And we recognize that it's impossible to have an agreement on the security architecture or the economic integration without addressing the conflicts in some way. And the interlinkages between those three different pieces of the regional order are really most vivid for the conflicts. We can't imagine having significant progress on the conflicts without progress on the other two, and vice versa. We can't imagine progress on the security architecture and economic integration without some movement on the conflicts as well. So our proposal is a set of more effective means for conflict management, a renewal of an international commitment to finding settlements, and additional incentives for parties to engage in these. And so this is sort of a bargain that through adopting measures that normalize the situation on the ground, the parties would receive a strong political commitment at the international level to reach mutually agreed settlements and be given incentives to engage in that process. So we have a quite comprehensive list of or accounting of conflict management measures, which, by the way, I should add, I've been consulted by people in the region, or policymakers in the region on this score. Pleasantly surprised by that. That we put under two different rubrics: pain reduction and risk reduction. Pain being the reference to the impact on populations, and risk in terms of security risk. And what are different? So there are some of these measures are being implemented today in some of the conflict regions. None of them are like we didn't reinvent the wheel here, but they would be agreed to by all the relevant parties. So in many cases today, conflict management measures are sort of unilaterally applied by one party or another, and I can get into details about what that means. They would be given multilateral endorsement at the international level, and there would be a guarantee of status neutrality. So a big roadblock to practical steps forward on, I don't know, transparency, or even things like return of people who stray across a conflict line being detained and not returned, is this concern about status. And what I mean by that, of course, is that in the case of, say, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there is a status dispute with, Russia and the two entities on the one side, and basically the rest of the world on the other, whereby Russia considers them independent states and Georgia considers them, and as I said, most of the rest of the countries in the world consider them part of Georgia. So at every turn in international negotiations, the fear that doing something practical would legitimize the other side's status arguments stops progress. And so here we have a guarantee that no one's going to abuse these to impose their policies on status. So of course, everyone's committed to finding settlements to conflicts. That's sort of, but we're trying to be different here, and we have some different principles that we propose, attached to these settlements. But the idea is that you really need to provide to states like Georgia that are affected by these conflicts a tangible sense that there is an international commitment to making progress, even if it has to be an open-ended negotiation, because no party is going to commit at the outset to radically transforming their positions, but they would potentially have the opportunity to transform those positions over the course of time in the context of a negotiation and mutual consent. We also talk about these additional incentives that might get some of these parties to the table, and perhaps in a more cooperative mindset. So it's a comprehensive conflict management program that's tied to this international recommitment to negotiate settlements, and would have a number of positive pragmatic effects on the ground. But I think, again, to underscore the point that this track needs to be addressed if you want any hope of addressing the other two. So this is just a sort of summary slide of the three pieces of the proposal in outline form. We also, in the piece, hopefully you read the last chapter of the report, we compare, where we are today on these issues and what the proposal is offering. And hopefully, if one were to look at this chart and say, okay, would I prefer what we have today or the proposal, maybe somebody might think in the future that, hey, that looks better. I would argue that if we were to be able to implement the proposal, it would certainly be better than what we have today. So we in the report, and this has been important, and I should also mention that we've briefed this, we've presented this report both in public and private settings, and some of this pre-COVID, and since COVID, a lot of it done virtually, in Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Russia, where there was a Russian translation, I should also add, of this document that's available if anyone would like it, in Washington, in Berlin, Vienna, and so on. And in the states in the region, one of the key things we like to emphasize is that, we actually try to be concrete about how it would affect them today, compared to their situation today, what it would mean for them. So, if you just take, I don't know, Moldova, or you can see how on each of these three scores, it would, one could make the case that it would be better under the proposal than what they have now. So, as I mentioned, we've presented this in a lot of places. So that I preempt perhaps some objections I often hear. I just we usually get these out on the table right now. So starting from the top, we've been told often that the term "in between states" denies these countries agency. Ironically, the whole purpose of this proposal was to grant them agency, and to restore their subjectness as opposed to being objects. But in any case, as I mentioned at the outset, in between, not only is it geographically, is it a geographic reality, it's also a phrase in English, where you say if you're caught in between, in this case, you're affected by a dispute, but you're not necessarily party to it. Often we get the case that basically this is just a Russia problem. We have all the instruments we need. It's just that one side isn't complying. The irony there, of course, is that unless you believe that Russia or any state, frankly, is incapable of behaving differently under different circumstances and with different incentives. And I happen to believe that's not true, that incentives and circumstances are important determinants of state behavior, that you have to think about what are the sets of circumstances, what are the policies that could induce different kinds of behavior. Often we get this idea that how come you're not saying that X country is evil and responsible for everything, all the problems that you write about. I should, of course, first note that, this was not Sam Charap's magnum opus. This was a report where I had to get, a Ukrainian and a Russian to sign up on the same piece of paper. How we handled, for example, describing, that is, stating what the conflicts are. We could not agree on that in our group, for example. So the Russian participant did not believe that there is a conflict in Crimea. Obviously, the Ukrainian participant did. So we reached a compromise by not listing the conflicts at all. And so anyone can sort of interpret that in the way they like. But the point here I'm making is that if we start with the blame question, we're not going to move beyond that, because none of the states involved are going to have the same agreed narrative about the past. And our point is that that's not really necessary. It doesn't really matter if states hold different ideas about what happened in the past if they are able to come to agreement about what to do in the future. And we're often told that the regional conflict proposals are too universal. How come you're not taking into account the specifics of this or that regional conflict? Of course, that is true. We offer in the report a menu of options, and without the expectation that they could be sort of picked up off the shelf and used, universally everywhere, but merely ideas that could be drawn from to reflect the particular circumstances on the ground in a given conflict zone. So the one with the guy and the arrow and the earth there, that is the idea that this proposal is akin to giving up on democratization in the region. The U.S. would have to forego, or the EU, its commitment to reform in these countries. I've always found that an interesting one. So in my view, there's nothing that in the proposal that would preclude the U.S. and the EU from furthering their efforts in governance reform, or democratization for that matter. I would make the case that it is the geopolitical competition itself that sets back reform. And so if you have any hope of wanting to really achieve sustainable market democracies in the region, you have to get the geopolitical conflict over the regional order under control. And then finally, of course, the idea that, and this is commonly heard in both Moscow, Washington, Berlin, and elsewhere, that the other side is just going to pocket any concessions we make. And so therefore, why should we bother doing it? And, I think the point here is that actually, it might be true that a negotiation or an international process ends up with that kind of outcome, but the situation today is worth risking, at least is bad enough that it's worth taking a chance and trying to achieve an alternative. Again, just to be clear, having actually worked in government, I know that this is not a policy proposal that can be adopted today. It was not meant to be that. It is a description of what might be possible that was intended to further the kind of discussions that hopefully we're going to have right now. And we invite and hope for quibbling with the details. But one of the things that I think we found striking in doing this is that these kinds of open discussions about the regional order are very rare. And there's just such a taboo or path dependency, if you want to put a fancy political science term on it, about ideas about regional order, like either you become a member of NATO and the EU, or you're automatically in the sort of Russia camp, for example, neither of which seem to me particularly useful ways of approaching this. So we need to be able to say, okay, well, what would be a potentially mutually acceptable outcome? We need to be having discussions both in, Western capitals in Moscow and in the capitals in the region about how to make how to improve the situation that we have today. And with that, I look forward to your questions and our discussion.